culture war inside of Marvel, specifically their comics division, rages on, but it's safe to say the first major battle has been a complete rout, with this past week the culture warriors showing complete confidence as they dance on the graves of the traditional comic book fans. It's important to understand the timeline and the tactics to educate ourselves on where everything went wrong for comics, because it's the exact same playbook they used in video games, Magic the Gathering, they're trying to use in Warhammer 40k, and coming to a beloved hobby near you. Where do we go from here? If you've been following my videos, you'll know that I'm kind of an old school comics fan from the early 90s, an original fan of comics like X-Men, Venom, Spider-Man, and Punisher, and things of that nature, and had a much more recent reinterest in comic books as I look for more interesting pastimes, for things to diversify my hobbies, as if I don't have enough going on behind me. And boy, I picked one heck of a time to come back. Within the first few weeks of making my first major comic repurchase, we had the huge faux outrage scandal that was the Make Mine Milkshake girls, which basically boiled down to some female Marvel employees having to endure one or maybe two semi-salty Twitter comments, and the entire social justice machine spinning up to paint all comic fans as sexist, misogynists, and bigots. A tale as old as time. Now, if I had to summarize what had been happening in comics over the past few years, it's basically play-by-play the same sort of things that happened with video games over the past few years. A focus on equality of outcome, representation over meritocracy in terms of employment, a focus on representation in story over narrative, in general, an adversarial relationship between pros and fans, slumping sales, and in general, a growing divide between what the fans actually want and what the company is churning out. Late this last week, we saw some excessive celebration and a hilarious pre-screen hire of a completely unqualified candidate. Someone who has literally never been in comics, never written a comic, and has shown zero interest in comics, whose qualification is literally being black and being from Chicago, just like the main character, Riri Williams. Let that sink in for a minute. This is something being held up by the culture warriors, being held up by this writer herself, that she would, quote, paraphrase, she would be a great writer for this comic book because she's also black and has the same haircut as Riri Williams. Now, you might think I'm sort of reducing it to the ridiculous here, but let's take a look at some facts that support exactly what I'm saying. And honestly, one of the most hilarious parts about this is that people don't see the hilarious racism and tokenism going on here. She literally admits that she is as bad as other crossover writers, and that her biggest qualification is her skin color. You can't make this sort of thing up. The actual tweet reads, I would actually love to do this. This is in response to writing the comic, right? I would actually love to do this. And I think I got the chops as much as any other crossover writer who's taken on Marvel title recently. And they've all done terrible, by the way. I've done self-study. Self-study. Yeah, okay. Of narrative techniques and comics for years. Okay. I've read Eisner, McCloud, Barry, and Brunetti. And then she follows up with this hot take. Also, Riri Williams has my haircut and general mode of dress. Slay queen. I just don't understand how someone can display this level of intellectual dishonesty. This is someone who would undoubtedly, if you read her Twitter feed, undoubtedly admonish token characters, or let's say a campaign that was exactly the same as this, but read something like where a white male would say that they're uniquely qualified to write a comic character who's also a white male because he's also white, and he wants a shot at that platform. It's absurd. And let me assure you that people like this are not interested in writing comic books. They're only interested in the platform to push their ideology. You don't need to go much further than writers like America Chavez, things like that, or for the the America Chavez comic book where you have ideological comic book writers forcing an ideology, the recent Black Panther comic books, things like that. It doesn't do well. And this is all about getting a bigger platform. She's willing to ignore her own obvious personal beliefs to get a chance at the Marvel platform. And to make this even more absurd, we have the Slacktivist personal favorite choice here in a change.org petition, which was launched and amassed a pretty sad, not unlike the sales of what a Riri Williams comic book would do, 2,500 signatures, and what can only be described as racists. To literally be signing a petition to not only to give a person a job based solely on the color of their skin, but also to then bar other people from this job based on the color of their skin, right? It's one thing to say, well, they're both black women, so we want to give the job to a black woman. But if you take it a step further, and make it more like what it is, the more sinister part of what it is, it's everybody of every other skin color cannot. We will not endorse anyone of any other skin color to write this comic book. I mean, if you look at just the actual image here on their change.org petition, their strongest point is the fact that they look alike. I mean, okay, I can't deny that they look alike. Now, if you want to have a real laugh, okay, if you want to have a real belly laugh, read the change.org petition for Eve Ewing's qualifications. Some are hilariously superficial, and others are things like, her father penned a weekly comic book, so it's literally in her blood. I mean, they also wrote as a strong hiring point is that she has 100,000 followers on Twitter. One need not go too far to look at some of these verified lunatics that work for Marvels who have both large Twitter followings and terrible comic book sales to completely debunk that as a reason to hire anybody. Now let's read one of my favorite things here. Let's actually read the qualification as put. Finally, Ewing is uniquely prepared to take on that challenge. She's a disciple in the craft of graphic narrative, following in the footsteps of adroit storytellers like Scott McCloud, Linda Berry, and Will Eisner. But here's where it gets good. To bring it even closer to home, her father penned a weekly comic strip when she was young, making her an inheritor of the comic book nerd gene. The honor and investment she's placed in the genes go beyond diversity. Diversity pushes. It's in her blood. Ewing's rising name in the writerly world with 100,000 Twitter followers. Well, I have a Magic the Gathering channel with 150,000 subscribers. Should I also write Magic cards? I mean, I'm assuming that's the where this logic is going. Look, if you're watching this video, I likely don't need to explain to you why this whole push is absurd. But as I mentioned in the open, this is an example of the culture warriors literally openly trying to place people in jobs through social pressure and their own brand of racism. They have won the battle so spectacularly in the early goings that they don't even have to try and wrap this sort of thing up and present it as anything else. Then it's just personal identity politics, and that's super sad. Well, actually, just for fun, I feel like we should point a few things out. This whole line of thinking, she's black and she looks like a character. Therefore, she is uniquely qualified to write that character is lunacy. Okay? As far as I know, the writer of Spider-Man was never written by a radioactive or bitten by a radioactive spider. Okay? The writer of Thor is not actually a god from another planet. Colossus isn't actually written by a Russian guy who can transform himself into metal. It is a absurdly infantile line of thinking that for some reason a comic book writer would be better if they look like the character. We've already seen this happen where certain editors come in and magically have comic characters that look like themselves, Heather Antos, but it is so rudimentary. It's like at its core, it's so wrong. Do you think that Tolkien was a Hobbit? Is that why he wrote Hobbit so well? Of course not. So how come this argument, when it's being made for diversity, is somehow totally different? How is this not absolutely racism? Thing is, comics have been around for a long time, just like many of our beloved hobbies. And I, for one, still have faith that things can correct themselves. There are even still pockets of sanity in the comic book prose world. I had an interaction with a comic writer last night, my very small Twitter following, follow at the quartering, who tweeted me and said, I asked him, what do you think about this change.org petition to get a writer a job because she looks like the character? And the reply was, I sent her a tweet telling her to add the word meritocracy to her lexicon, and after doing hard work, she would be supported as a comic book writer. What? Like, coming out of the comic book prose? I was rightfully blown away by that response. I didn't think there were reasonable people left in the comic industry. But he confirmed that there are, in fact, reasonable folks out there. They are the silent and mostly doing their own thing. That's true. A lot of good writers just leave companies like Marvel because they don't pay anyway. I do little Marvel stuff now because the environment... Or I do little Marvel stuff now because the environment there is quite toxic, and the nepotism and mediocrity are rampant. What a beautiful way to put it. What a absolutely beautiful way to put the state of comics coming out of Marvel right now. But there are still good people there from other countries. Not sure what he's meaning there, but maybe people he knows or something like that. I mean, there has to be a breaking point here. Imagine you're a comic writer who's been grinding away to get into your dream job at Marvel. You've been classically trained. You're an artist. You're an editor. You've got your own books published. You want to apply for this job writing for this new book, and they say, well, the character is a black woman, so we're just going to hire a black woman. Oh, she must be uniquely qualified. She must have written a lot of other comics. No, she's never written a comic. She's not even into comics, but, we'll find something else for you. I mean, I can't even imagine how that would feel. And these writers and editors are going to speak out. There's no doubt in my mind. Okay, getting to what I think are three fair things that we can do as fans of comics, or maybe better described as three predictions of what will continue to happen. None of these situations are ideal or options are ideal, and I think it's also, so that we manage our own expectations, it's also important to understand that the far most likely scenario is that Marvel will just continue to do what it's doing. They haven't cared about sales to this point. They haven't cared about customer complaints to this point. They haven't cared about local comic book shops closing down at this point. I'm not sure any continued action is going to have a high percentage chance of fixing anything. But let's consider three things we can do. One is to continue to push business to indie comics in hopes to, at minimum, keep them up and running. Back new comics on Kickstarter, go out of your way to seek out smaller companies who might have books, exchange recommendations. Like this comment section down below would be a great spot to do that, to share lesser known comics that need support. Hopefully they would be, still be able to be acquired by local comic shops, and we could minimize the damage to them, and voice the demand loudly enough that at least to keep these other options alive for us. Two, I think, obviously, abandoning Marvel altogether, even the titles and authors that we enjoy, is probably the next most logical salvo to fire. I'm really not confident that Marvel even really cares about revenue, but hopefully Disney would eventually. But given its current behavior, we're not seeing a lot of reaction to the market. They just continue to follow the path that they're on. But I think if you're going to have an impact, one thing that Marvel would take notice of is DC passing them, at least in sales, or DC extending beyond them, or to get pressure from some third party. In terms of DC, Mr. Miracle is a great place to start. It's one of the best book series I've ever read. I'm always excited for new issues to come out, and that's a DC comic. And that's something to consider. I was thinking I had the newest issue downstairs, but I think it's upstairs. And the third option is really to leave comics altogether. And this is something that I really thought about when this started to happen in Magic the Gathering. And I just don't think it's the best option, but I think a lot of people will take it because a lot of people don't have a lot of time to fuss around with all this stuff. They don't have YouTube channels where they can bloviate around about the thing for 20 minutes to get things off their chest and then go back to reading comic books. So, I don't know. I think people might just say, forget it and go do something else. That's what I did with Magic the Gathering. I still play, but 10% of what I used to play. Now I play like deck building games, or I play retro video games, or I play other things like Hero Realms, Star Realms. All the stuff behind me is why it's behind me. I'm trying to promote other options than Magic because I want to have some impact on them. I'm not a big boycott guy. I don't think they ever do anything, but decreased sales over a long period of time absolutely gets noticed. And to summarize everything, to bring it all home, unfortunately, I think the next real victims here are not really the fans of comics. I think we'll always find something to enjoy, but it's the comic book store owners. I feel near and dear to this topic because I feel connected to local game stores and Magic the Gathering for the same reason. Most local comic shops or card shops essentially take a vow of poverty to deliver comic books to the fans that cherish them. They don't have any control over the books that end up on their shelves and will undoubtedly be the next casualty in this culture war with Marvel Comics, as the only logical counterstrike for the fans is to simply stop showing up. And where this all ends, I can't really predict right now, but what I thought made sense was to leave you with a quote from Neville Chamberlain. In war, whichever side may call itself the victor, there are no winners, but all are losers.